We're glad you're here, and hope you've had a good first part of your week. And we thank you for being a part of our midweek class. If you want to be opening back to John chapter 18, we're going to start in verse 12 here in a little bit. And while you're turning, let me update you on some events that will be are fast approaching. This coming Sunday, of course, is our Young at Heart banquet, and hopefully you got the information about that. And technically, the deadline has supposed to have expired, but if you didn't sign up and you want to go, just call the office tomorrow, and I'll guarantee you there'll be a space for you. This coming Sunday, right after morning worship. And the annual Young at Heart banquet is just one of the highlights of the winter, and is actually kind of the transitions us over into hopefully the beginning of spring. So that's coming up this Sunday. Then next Saturday, well, actually 2 weeks from this coming Saturday, March the 2nd. Is our winter men's breakfast. We had one back in the fall, did not have one through the holidays. And there's a sign-up sheet for you to sign up for that. You can come early. There'll be coffee on, and you can visit. Meal will be about 8 o'clock is about eating time for that men's breakfast. And again, every time we have one, there's always a couple of suspicious characters out there that want to know, okay, why are you feeding us? What's the angle? No angle, no agenda, just come and eat. Yes, James? Well, see, they're ready. They're already ready. That's pretty good to be 2.5 weeks out. So anyway, just take note of that coming up on the 2nd. Ladies, the following Saturday, March the 9th, will be the Ladies' Day for this year. Celine Sparks will be the speaker, and childcare will be provided. They're having a continental breakfast, kick things off about 9, and then we'll conclude with lunch. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, still got time to do that, but those events here within the next few weeks. So just didn't want that to sneak up on you. Teenagers, parents, if you have teens that are going on the spring retreat, the deadline for that is tonight. So make sure they have signed up and try to get that balance covered as soon as possible. But yeah, deadline for the spring retreat is tonight. Now, our prayer list is about as abbreviated as it's been in a good while, and for that we're grateful. We found out that Sister Charlotte Causey was to come home yesterday, and we haven't heard anything to the contrary. James? Okay. Good. Had some physical therapy and got her strength up, and so she is home, which is good news and good to hear that. So, but continue to remember Charlotte and Charles both. They both have their own respective health issues, and but we'll continue to remember them. And then Jerry Baker had 2 heart procedures last week. He had a couple of stents put in, and then a couple of days later, they put in a pacemaker. So I talked to Greta this past Monday. She was taking him back to his cardiologist Monday afternoon, and hopefully everything looked good. And but he and Greta both have just had a tough time. Greta had very invasive back surgery back in the fall, and is still in the recovery stage from that. And now Jerry has had this little setback, so hopefully that's got him in a good place right now. So remember both Jerry and Greta Baker in your prayers. Anybody else that we do not know about?
Jessica Alewine, that's Hewland's granddaughter, has pneumonia, and they have requested that we put her on the prayer list.
Okay, Jessica Alewine, this is Hewlin's granddaughter, right? Hewlin and Judy's granddaughter, and right now she's battling pneumonia. I'm hearing a lot of that here in the last few weeks. You know, we kept hearing about COVID and flu, and now pneumonia has evidently got one last gasp, hopefully before spring. But add Jessica Allewine to your prayer list. Anybody else? Let's bow. Father, we pause thanking you for the opportunity to allow us to be here tonight, and for those who are a part of our class through our live stream, for that we're grateful. It does afford us the opportunity to be informed about folks who are having a difficult time, and we mentioned Charlotte Causey and the fact that she was able to come home, and for that we're grateful. We pray for Charles as he continues to ensure that her needs are being met. Likewise for Jerry and Greta Baker. And mindful of Jerry's surgery last week, and that would put him in a better place, and that Greta would continue to see improvement following her back surgery. There are others who are confined at home. We're mindful of Jessica Allewine and the difficulty that she's having with pneumonia. There are still others who are battling seasonal illnesses and are not able to be with us tonight, and we ask a special blessing on them. We take note, Father, of the times transitioning over into spring, with spring breaks upon us in another few weeks. A lot of people traveling, and we certainly pray for everyone's safety. We continue to be mindful of events throughout our country, acts of violence and just a total lack of regard for the intrinsic value of human life, and we see that on so many different levels. And we just pray, Father, for ways in which we as your children can, by example and by action, model the life of your Son. There was a life of love and compassion, and that we would emulate those traits day in and day out in our lives. We're thankful for your word, for the opportunity that we have now to study, and we ask your richest blessings on us as we go through the balance of the week. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, got something a little different tonight. Obviously, I don't ordinarily use PowerPoint, but what I wanted to, and I started with it last week, and trying to point out some of the examples of just how egregious the 18th chapter of John is from the standpoint of and I even hesitate to call it a trial, because it wasn't that. And the word that keeps coming back to mind is the word irony. When you think about this, Jesus was the only person to live his entire life without ever doing anything wrong. And yet, as we noted last week, he's arrested, he'll be tried, convicted, condemned, and he'll suffer a death that was only reserved by the Roman government for the absolute worst criminals. And his arrest was the result of a betrayal. The trials that he'll go through are farcical, and his conviction was illegal, and his punishment was a slap at justice. And yet through it all, what is consistent is the calmness, the honesty, the dignity that he will exude through all of this. A couple of things. In fact, we noted this last week about I say arrest, at least his apprehension in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then, of course, verse 12 tells us about the beginning of what will turn out to be an extremely long night. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane. That's when Judas shows up with this entourage of temple guards and security forces. They take him, and from there they'll bring him back to Jerusalem to begin a series of 6 trials. He'll go 3 before the Jewish authorities and 3 before the civil authorities. And what I want to do tonight is to just kind of start by examining these trials and then, you know, the differences in all of these. We talked about Peter's impulsive lashing out last week, and verse 11 is really a defining moment in this whole scenario, because Jesus says, "The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink of it?" In other words, he has come to that conclusion that that's what he's got to do. First century Israelites were a very law-conscious people, and for the most part, they had maintained a very strict procedure for when it came to civil and criminal cases. And if you look on the slide there, the Mishnah. Mishnah is a collection of books compiled about 200 AD. And it records the oral traditions that had been handed down by the rabbis from one generation to another over the last several hundred years, actually going back to the time of the Intertestament period. A portion of that document, and in fact I'll give you the notation as we go through this, a portion of that document describes the guidelines that governed the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And they were responsible, especially through the Intertestament period, and to some degree during the time of Roman occupation. They would hear cases and they would render judgment, and then they would pass sentence on either the guilty or the innocent. And this document is basically designated as Sanhedrin 4, Volume 4. And this document describes the traditions that governed the Sanhedrin during the time of Jesus' trial. And what I want to do is walk through the blatant violation of their own laws in order to bring about this travesty of justice on Jesus. And I mentioned, I just got a hold of one last week. Jason, if you'll pull up the first one, there we go. According to Mishnah 4 in the first paragraph, no trials were to occur during the night hours, certainly not before the morning sacrifice of the next day. So trials were not to need to be convened during nighttime hours. And here again, all of this I'm basing on an article written by Lorna Berg, The Illegalities of Jesus' Religious and Civil Trials. She published in the theological journal Bibliotheca Sacra in 2004, volume 161, the July to September issue. And I've got that on the last slide if you want to jot that down. So, no trials were to occur during the night hours, but in actuality, what happened? Well, Jesus was taken to Annas, Caiaphas, and to the Sanhedrin all at night. So they just blatantly ignored their own law. Rule number 2, and by the way, lest you wonder, how long is this? There are 18 of these. 18 of their own laws that they're just going to totally ignore. And I wouldn't be taking this much time with this, but I read the article and I thought, we need to know this. We need to know that there was so much more going on here than just, it's kind of a mock trial. No, it's much more than that. Number 2, trials were not to occur on the eve of the Sabbath or during festivals. They just took a break from that. You didn't have legal procedures that were in the process of developing. Same citation, Sanhedrin 4 in the first paragraph. But what actually happened? Well, the trials occurred at night during the Passover celebrations. This was all during the week of unleavened bread. This was during the Passover week. And so really, whether they had even decided to hold his trial during the daytime, they still couldn't have done it because it was during the festival. Number 3, all trials were to be public. Secret trials were forbidden. There was no behind closed doors. They didn't do that. Same citation. This is in earlier Sanhedrin Volume 1 on page 6. What actually happened? Well, if you remember, and we'll note again, Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin at night for questioning and was immediately declared guilty. Only his official sentencing took place during the day. And so they met at night. They were in behind closed doors. And you didn't do that. Number 4, and this is kind of connected to this. All trials, according to their law, all trials were to be held in the hall of judgment in the temple area. So consequently, it was for public, the public would be there. If they wanted to view the proceedings, they could because it was in that region of the temple area. But in actuality, Jesus will first be taken to Annas and then Caiaphas and then put before the Sanhedrin. So those are the 3 Jewish trials. He'll go to Annas and then to Caiaphas and then before the Sanhedrin. None of which were in the hall of judgment. Number 5, capital cases required a minimum of 23 judges. Now here, we got a question mark because in actuality, we don't know how many judges were present. The Bible doesn't say. But really, the fact that they were taking place at night and they weren't in the hall of judgment, it really doesn't matter if there were 23 judges there or not. Their assembly was illegal in that regard. Number 6, an accused person could not testify against himself. But in reality, the Sanhedrin convicted Jesus on his own words and didn't see the need for witnesses. There would be no witnesses called in that third trial before the Sanhedrin. You could not, a person could not take the stand and that be used against them. But they did it. Rule 7. Someone was required to speak on behalf of the accused. What do we call that in our own judicial system? Yeah, court-appointed lawyer. If you can't afford one will be appointed for you. Well, according to the Mishnah, someone was required to speak on behalf of the accused. Well, what about Jesus? No one spoke for him. And when he objected to the fact that it was illegal, I can't read illegality, well, there you go. Thank you, South Alabama. When he objected to it, he was struck in the face, which, by the way, and we'll get to this maybe tonight, what did he object to? That and the fact that Annas was not even the high priest. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, was the high priest, and yet Annas was convening, and Jesus knew it was illegal. And so his point is, why are you even questioning me? And that's when he was slapped, and the person that slapped him said, what? Is that the way you talk to the high priest? Well, yeah, but he's not the high priest. We'll talk about him in a few moments. Yes. He was appointed originally by Quirinius about AD 6. And in fact, well, I'll get to that in a moment too, but there'll be a line of his sons and grandson and a grandson of his who will fill that. And it was a very lucrative position, to say the least. So, no one spoke for Jesus, and when he objects to the illegality of the proceeding, they slapped him. Number 8, conviction required the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses to be in perfect alignment. Sounds pretty familiar too, right? Our system does the same thing. A witness's testimony has to be consistent. Well, in reality, the prosecution, that is, the Jewish leaders, sought witnesses against Jesus, but they couldn't even agree on their lies. Their lies didn't even agree. Number 9, witnesses for the prosecution were to be examined and cross-examined extensively. In other words, the Sanhedrin would then further question witnesses as to the credibility and the legitimacy of their testimony. Well, when it came to Jesus, though, witnesses were sought out solely for the purpose of conviction. The idea of acquitting and or even arriving at the truth was never even part of it. And by the way, what is the kind of the mantra of our judicial system? And I see it all the time watching Cops in 48 Hours. Every suspect is presumed innocent. It was the same way with the Sanhedrin. They went into it with the understanding, okay, this person is innocent, and it becomes the burden of the prosecution to prove their guilt. But here, never seems to be brought into the discussion. They didn't bring witnesses in for the purpose, for any other reason other than convicting him. All right, number 10. Capital cases were to follow a strict order, beginning with arguments by the defense, then arguments for conviction. Again, watch Matlock. If you don't know how we do things in our system, that's it. The defense goes first, and then the prosecution presents their case. It was the same thing here. Except, when it comes to Jesus, what? No one spoke in his defense, either before or after the accusations were leveled. No court-appointed attorney, no one, they didn't do that. Number 11, this was one that I had never encountered. All Sanhedrin judges could argue for acquittal, but not all could argue for conviction. Now, let's stop for a moment and go back and remind ourselves about the composition of the Sanhedrin, made up of Sadducees and Pharisees. What did those two religious/political parties have in common? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You had one group that rabidly insisted on the reality of the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, on the other hand, strictly denied it. You had one group that only accepted Genesis through Deuteronomy as part of the Bible, and the Pharisees, of course, took all 39. Maybe not the book of Esther, but anyway, nothing in common. And so all judges could argue for acquittal, but not all could argue for conviction. What happened with Jesus? The chief priest and the council sought witnesses against him. They were all, nobody spoke out for. Now, let me pause here for a moment. We want to assume that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus would have argued for his acquittal. And they may have. I'm not going to say they didn't, but none of the Gospels record that. None of them recorded that. Now, well, that's the other part. We're not even sure if they were even on the premises. Because if they got 23 together, not that mattered. You know, we don't know.
It is rather unique, and I don't remember which movie it was, but either the greatest story ever told or the Passion of Christ.
Right.
It does have a piece in there where Nicodemus took up.
Right. And again, it's certainly not anti-biblical, but it's extra biblical because it doesn't say. Oh, sure, yeah, and I think that's we hope that's what happened. But again, from the textual standpoint, it doesn't say. Number 12, and this is their law: the high priest should not participate in the questioning. And we know from John's account what? Both Annas and Caiaphas interrogated Jesus directly, asking him questions that were designed to do what? Nothing more than incriminate him. 13. Each witness in a capital case was to be examined individually, not in the presence of other witnesses. Why would you think that would be a law? Right, it kept them from collaborating, their stories, and here again, our system does the same thing. We do that, police will interrogate witnesses differently to see if they're telling the same story. All right? What about Jesus? We don't know. We don't know how many witnesses were brought to testify at any given time. So that's kind of an unknown in that regard. Number 14, the testimony of two witnesses found to be in contradiction rendered both invalid. In fact, in our system, that's called what? Well, they throw it out based on, under the canopy of insufficient evidence. It's thrown out. But in reality, with Jesus, what? The testimony of so-called witnesses did not agree. Why? Because they were paid. They were paid witnesses. So no, they're not going to agree. Number 15, voting for conviction. Now watch this one. Voting and sentencing in a capital case was to be conducted individually, beginning with the youngest. So younger members could not be influenced by the voting of older members. Now this is right in the oral tradition, later written down in the Mishnah. When they went around, they asked them individually how they voted. Guilt or acquittal. Guilt or acquittal. And they would start with the youngest member and work that. And how many were there? 70. Had 70 men in the Sanhedrin. So it was a very orderly process of individual voting. It wasn't, everybody raise your hand, yay or nay, the ayes have it, the motion carries. No, that was the way the law was written. But what did they do with Jesus? Well, the members of the Sanhedrin voted simultaneously and almost rioted. So again, thrown out the door. Number 16, verdicts in capital cases were to be handed down only during daylight hours. Now this is really interesting here because it speaks to the underhanded hypocrisy on the part of the Sanhedrin. Verdicts were to be handed down only during daylight hours. But what happened? Well, the Sanhedrin convicted Jesus and condemned him then, but then they met the next morning to give the appearance of order. They went ahead and met when the daylight came, so everybody would think, oh, well, this is why they're meeting. They're meeting for the purpose of handing down. No, they'd already done that. Number 17, members of the Sanhedrin were to meet. This is interesting too. They were to meet in pairs all night, discuss the case, and reconvene for the purpose of confirming the final verdict and imposing sentence. What happened with Jesus? All we see in the gospel accounts is a rush to judgment, no indication that the judges met for any reason, least of all, to find Jesus not guilty. They didn't do that. And then the last one. You're probably thinking, finally, the last one, number 18. Sentencing in a capital case was not to occur until the following day. But again, same thing I said earlier. They convicted and condemned him right then, and then went through the facade of convening the next day just to show that they were following the law, when they had made a mockery of the law through this entire thing. Now, Jason, if you'll go to primary sources, you can even Google the Mishnah. You can buy bound copies of it. Otherwise, you can read Lorna Berg's article, the illegalities of Jesus' religious and civil trials. And again, that's all online as well. But I don't know. Give me your reaction to that, because here again, we read that in the gospel narrative, and none of that's pointed out. For many of the gospel writers, and for good reason. But you start putting together this whole chronicle of events that start here in verse 12 of John 18. And I put all that out there so that as we walk through it over the course of the next tonight and next week, probably the next week, you'll have at least a familiarity with what's going on here, and it's tragic. We can go back in our own history, in American history, and we can see instances when justice was just run roughshod. And you had a jury, or you had any number of people in high positions who were determined that this individual was going to be found guilty, regardless of evidence, regardless of Yes, Keith.
Why did they hate him so?
That's a good question. Keith had asked, why did they hate and resent him to this point?
Now, the Romans would not have crucified him.
No, the Romans, for the most part, all that they were wanting to do is just keep the peace. They were just trying to keep these crazy Jews from flying off the handle. But the Jewish leaders were smart enough to get Pilate involved, because they knew the Jewish leaders wanted the Romans to kill him. And we go back to John 11, and I think my initial reaction to your question is, why did they hate him so much? It's because they were scared to death of him. They were scared to death of him. Because they said, if this man keeps doing what he's doing, and this is right after he raised Lazarus from the dead, and they said, if he keeps doing this, he'll draw everybody to him, and the Romans will come in and take away our power, really. They said, our holy place. It was Caiaphas, yeah. It was Caiaphas that said that. Yes? Oh, sure, yeah. It would make a kangaroo court look legitimate. There was just nothing. There was nothing. When you violate 18 of your own statutes, Brad.
And without a doubt, you have 4 accounts of this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
And no doubt one of their purposes in the way they wrote it was to show the illegitimacy of it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it, and that's why they didn't have to spell it out the way I did it, a while ago. They didn't have to. The people knew, and by the way, you stomach all that, and then what really you just step back and shake your head is why they wouldn't take the 30 pieces of silver back from Judas when he tried to give the money back. They said, we can't take that. Why? Oh, that would be against the law. That would violate the law because that's blood money. Why would they go and aggravate Pilate again about removing the bodies off of the cross, removing those bodies so quickly? Exactly. We can't have those. Well, wait. Why are you so worried about Passover all of a sudden? Here's another dumb one, and we'll point this out. When they leave the Sanhedrin and they take Jesus to Pilate, the chief priest will not go in. Why? Oh, if we go in his house, then we will defile ourselves and not be able to eat the Passover. What? Now you're worried about defiling yourself? It's just. That was the other thing. You had that mob mentality at work in that regard. Well, during the first century, and especially actually before this, after the time of the Hasmoneans, or the time of John Hyrcanus, after the time of the Maccabees, the high priest held essentially the same authority as a king. The difference was his appointment had to be approved by Rome, and he governed under the authority of the Roman procurator, in this case under Pilate. And what's interesting, though Caiaphas had held the office before, Annas was the true power behind the office, his father-in-law. Caiaphas was the sitting high priest, but Annas was really the man behind the position. Annas was appointed by Quirinius, who at that time, if you remember, was the governor of Syria, about AD 6. And then he was later deposed by Quirinius's successor in AD 15. But he remained the head of a vast empire of religious corruption. And you think, okay, was it kind of like the mafia? Yeah, probably. There was the family of the high priest, and we assume they may have been of the tribe of Levi, but there is absolutely no way they were of the household of Aaron. There's no way. At this point, that was no longer a consideration. After he was removed in 15 AD, he wielded power through his next son, Eleazar, and then through his son-in-law, Caiaphas, here at the trial of Jesus. In fact, there would be an unbroken line through 4 more sons after Caiaphas, and then a grandson. So Annas, even though he wasn't the high priest, he wielded a tremendous amount of power and influence. And addition to the aristocracy of the Sanhedrin, of the Sadducees, Annas is the one who held the monopoly on animals that were deemed acceptable for sacrifice in the temple. According to the law of Moses, priests were to determine which animals were of sufficient quality, and then, of course, Annas controlled the priest. This is why, see, here again, you read all this, and you think, on 2 occasions, Jesus came to Jerusalem, went to the temple, and just had a come apart. Just went nuts, as it were, and cleaned all that out. And did it do any good? No, they just set it up. Why? Because of the deep-rooted corruption that was there. Now, I said all that to say this. Verse 12 of John 18, Jesus is taken from the garden, and the first place is before Annas. Now keep in mind, he's not the high priest, but he is mob boss. That makes sense? He's the godfather. He's the mob boss. And Annas questions Jesus about his disciples, about his teaching, and what does Jesus say? I've spoken openly to the world. This is verse 19. I taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews came together. I spoke nothing in secret. Here again, why do you question me? It's a legitimate question. Why? He's not the high priest. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. And then that's when they slapped him, and Jesus said, is that the way? And they said to Jesus, is that the way you answer the high priest? Well, yeah, if he was in fact the high priest, but he wasn't. And of course, Jesus said, if I've spoken wrongly, point that out. Testify to the wrong, but if I'm right, why did you strike me? And this is where 6 of those 18 points of order were ignored. Took place at night, during the week of the Passover, behind closed doors, away from the temple. Annas was pretending that he had jurisdiction when really he didn't. And then as Jesus points out, witnesses should have been pretty easy to find. Why? I did everything out in the open. I spoke, I taught in the synagogues. I taught in the temple. It shouldn't have been that hard to find somebody who could testify what he said. But none had been summoned. So, they leave there, and then they go before the actual high priest. I put that in quotation marks. And this, of course, is Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas. And by the way, this is another instance where nepotism rarely works in business. It certainly doesn't work well in religion and when it involves power and money. So here we have nepotism at its worst. The Sanhedrin, of course, continued to level their charges, and again, as we noted, that was a violation of their own rules, and they did not presume him to be innocent. They presumed him guilty and never strayed from that. The high priest stands up. This is beginning in verse 24, and it's at this point, by the way, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke pick up their account. Matthew in Matthew 26, Mark in Mark 14, and Luke in Luke 22. This is where all 4 of them, are on the same page, as it were, as far as the narrative. The high priest asked Jesus, and Jesus says nothing. And Caiaphas says, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? He didn't say anything. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? That question was meant to do what? Just get him to own up to the blasphemy. And at this point, Jesus said, I am. And, of course, he knew this from the outset. But it's almost like he's saying, you know what? I'm just going to cut to the chase here. I'm going to make it easy for him. I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, the question is, when did they see that? Or have they seen that yet? There's an interesting discussion among New Testament scholars. Some believe that what Jesus was referencing here was not necessarily his second coming, but what? The destruction of Jerusalem. In which case Jesus came then in judgment. And I lean toward that. I tend to think that's what he was referencing, that they would see him coming with the clouds of heaven. And then, of course, he tears his robe, and what further need do we have of witnesses? In other words, what? We're not calling any witnesses. And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Note that in Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 60, they all condemned him to be. They couldn't do that. They could all, vote to acquit him, but they couldn't all vote to condemn him. And here again, you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts. That was right after Jesus went before Annas. So again, it would stand to reason that it took place when? At night. And that one breaks up. Members of the Sanhedrin vent their anger, and then, before retiring for the night. The third trial is going to take place beginning in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and verse 66 of Luke 22. In this third trial, Jesus is appearing before the Sanhedrin. And the issue here is that there's some problems to solve if they themselves are going to do something about Jesus. Verse 31 of John 18 tells us what? They didn't have the authority to put him to death. Which means, we've mentioned 18, let's add a 19th one to Acts 7, when they took Stephen and drug him out of the hall of judgment, out of the gates of Jerusalem, and stoned him. John 18:31 says what? They didn't have the authority. So what they did to Stephen was in fact what? That was illegal. And I have contended a long time. Stephen was not executed, he was lynched. That was nothing more than a lynching. Okay, let's put a mark right there because I want to pick up with this third trial, and then it gets real interesting when they leave the Sanhedrin and they go to Pilate. And I guess my goal tonight is that if you can go back and read this and it just not boil your blood, then there's something wrong. But at the same time, that's tempered by the fact that none of this was a surprise to Jesus. Not at all. Brad?
And you could also say that because of who he was, he could have stopped it with a word.
We noted that last week, that when you go back to the discussion in the garden, and we do, and I mentioned this last week, we sing the song, he could have called 10, as I said last week, the numerical value was more like 72,000. But that doesn't roll off the tongue in the song, 10,000 rolls off better in the chorus. It'll be hard to fit 72, but that's probably a more accurate number. Yes, sir?
If they had really looked at the Old Testament prophecies and they looked on him whom they pierced.
Right.
And Isaiah 53, just familiarity with the Old Testament,
And unfortunately, their familiarity with their own law had long since waned. There was only one, and it speaks so relevant to our culture. The only thing they were concerned about was health, wealth, and power. I think I'll end it on that one, and we'll pick up here next week.